Hello, this is Desmond Butts, and today we're going to talk about performances on takeoffs and some common mistakes that happen to come about while on climb out. Now, I'm going to apologize right now because I have a performance program I use for passenger jets. And it worked out pretty good, but there's some reflection I saw later after I pulled up the video that I didn't notice in filming, and I apologize for that at the moment, but please bear with me with that. Also later on, there is a video of me doing a takeoff and a landing in the pattern at hooks, and that'll be toward the end of it, so you can kind of see everything put together and how it actually works. Thanks a lot for watching, and please share these with people that you think might need this information. Okay, what we have here are sections out of an autogyro POH. And we're going to spend most of our time really on these two in the middle. We're only going to touch on a couple of the others, but I'll explain them very briefly. Okay? This one right here, and I'm going to move this to center, is actually the base calculations of performance speeds, and if there's other limitations you refer to a different section. The problem with these speeds here in the center is they're usually calculated based at standard conditions. You can say, I wrote that right here, that's 2992, 15 degrees Celsius, or 59 degrees Fahrenheit, one person. Most of us don't fly in those conditions, and it's also at sea level. So a lot of these speeds are going to not give you the performance data that you really need, because that is not what standard conditions happen to be in most cases, because we're flying two up and the conditions are different. Because of this, this was just best data that they did in testing the gyro. This particular data is very, very close to the MTO Sport, the MTO Sport 17, the Calidus, and the Cavalon. So from right now, I'm not going to worry about this too much more. I'm going to show this, however, 75 kilometers equals 40 knots, and I'm going to get into that in a moment, and I'll put this off to the side. These are the speeds for safe operation for the autogyro groups, and they're very, very similar for all three of their main products. Best climb for safe operation, okay, is going to be 100 to 110 kilometers. Now I've calculated these out so that we know what they are. They're on this sheet, and to give you a little better of an idea, they're written right here. 100 kilometers is about 54 knots. 110 is about 59 knots. 90, which it shows here, is 49 knots. I usually have students try to climb out on takeoff for very good reasons, which I'll get into in a moment, between 50 and 55 knots, and 55 on descent. Generally, I try to have them remember one number, because 100 kilometers is very close to 54. I rounded it up because you can see the line on the 55 knot mark on the airspeed indicator easier. So I just said, let's just call it 55. I know they're going to have 1 knot extra, little bit of cushion room, especially if they're fully loaded. And I want that one for climb and that one for descent. And those figures I have gotten off of Section 4 Normal Procedures, Safe Operations Airspeeds, right here out of the POH. Because I have had conflict with people saying that's not what the POH says, but it says it right here. That's because in a probably inappropriate way, they're taking these speeds out of the POH that were pretty much testing speeds in standard conditions. And I will, as explained earlier, show why that's probably not the best idea. Now let's move on over here to this, what's called the height velocity diagram. Hopefully you can see this. There is an arc right here, and there's a dotted line right here. If we're looking at these profiles, this is the avoid area. You do not want to be lifting off or climbing out inside of this red arc. There's a lot of people who have accidents, usually because they're using a speed that's probably inappropriate for climb out and lift off, staying at that speed and making a mistake while doing so, climbing out too slow, and they'll be climbing out right about in here, which is right in this little corner. Now, there are two versions of this. I would call this, just for simplicity's sake, a coffin corner. Now, that term is commonly also used in high performance or jet aviation for big aircraft, and that coffin corner is at high altitude. But for all practical purposes, just for teaching and for you to understand it better, let's call taking off inside of this, behind the power curve, inside the coffin corner. If I were to use the climb out speed that they did, they're testing at single person with these perfect conditions at 40 knots, okay, that's 75 kilometers. That's right in here, and it is exactly inside that coffin corner. And I think that there's sometimes people that wrongly think that that is okay because they lift it off the runway to be able to keep climbing at that, and they might get away with it. They might get away with it for a long time because they're single person, it's nice conditions in the wintertime, and they're able to do it. Then they get in a hot day, maybe at an airport they're not familiar with at like 3,000 feet or so, and two people, and they're trying to do this, and they sink right into the trees. And there's several videos on YouTube of people doing this exact kind of thing, and I believe it could be related to them going off at an inappropriate speed, because the airspeed for safe operations clearly says you should be between 100 and 110 on your climb. Okay? That's where I put these notes here. So if you're at 90 on the climb, this little dotted line I put right here is just outside of the coffin corner, 50 knots. 55 knots is exactly on this dashed line, and that's the profile I've been teaching and been recommending to people for 9 years now. Okay? Now we're going to get into some other things that hopefully will make a little more sense. These other graphs right here talk a little bit about the demonstration I did on my iPad showing how weight changes the performance of liftoff and changes airspeed and climb. And they're a little bit difficult to read, but those can be found on these 3 pages right here. And they're in section 5 on the POH. Now I'm using autogyros on this because I also fly Titanium Explorers, and their figures are so close that it's not worth even trying to bring up other ones. Same with some of the other major manufacturers out there that have the newer style 2-seat gyroplanes. I'm going to show a couple of diagrams here on the gyro race board next. What I've drawn here is actually a runway with a 50-foot obstacle. Now, this is kind of how this works, just so I can try to explain this. This, we'll just call it a nice, very clean-cut grass strip. Let's just say that the grass strip itself gives you 1,000 feet, just to make it easy. So between here and here is 1,000 feet between both sides. Now we got a 50-foot tree at the end. So let's say our performance on this particular aircraft says you need 1,000 feet runway to clear a 50-foot obstacle. This means that there is a liftoff point that they calculated that from, and I'm going to show that in green. Now, there's 2 X's here, and I'm going to talk about those really quick. What happens is, a lot of times, people wrongly think, if they take off early, in what many people might call as ground effect, there's less friction, they'll speed up, and they will climb out better. This is actually false, and I'll explain that in a minute, because once you get into the air, the angle of the attack of the rotor blade actually causes more drag than to balance with it flatter pitched on the ground and lifting off at the correct spot, which is right there. If you delay it and you overspeed and you end up here on liftoff, you also will not be able to clear. So these two are wrong. Now, let me make a correction here. We are not talking about soft field takeoffs. If you have soft short field like this, normally you wouldn't be doing this anyway because you got a 50-foot obstacle and you'd go fly another day or something else, or take off the other direction if the wind favors taking off this way where there's no obstacle. I learned to fly in Costa Rica the gyroplanes. We had a 950-foot grass strip. On one end we had an 80-foot tree, not a 50, but a really tall one. On the other end, there was about 20-foot trees. If we didn't make it off by middle, we aborted about 500 feet. Generally, our liftoff point to make sure we had proper climb was about between 300 and 500 feet, depending on temperature and weight and condition. Sometimes we did take off toward the 80-foot tree, but the tree was on one side and we could turn and bank it off to the other side, but we didn't prefer it that way, and the wind favored the other direction anyway, taking off toward the 20-foot trees. So, obviously, if we delay takeoff, okay, to here, we're overspeeding, we eat up precious runway, and then when you do lift off, we don't have enough distance to make the clearance at Vx or Vy, doesn't matter. If we lift off very, very close to Vx, which in this case would be between 50 and 55 knots, we have adequate room, we have the perfect angle, we're easily able to clear the obstacle. If we're down here and we lift off early, what ends up happening is because of the angle of attack of the rotor being high-pitched and we are in the air, we start getting what we call a circular puddle of air that creates more drag than it does to allow it to have more of a proper angle of climb out speed, which we talked about in regards to the POH discussion earlier. This allows it to be able to have the right speed for the safest climb out by allowing it to stay on the runway. Now, there's lots of techniques for staying on the runway. Whether you keep the wheel slightly on the ground or you balance with it off, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is to lift off above 50, right where you're in that best rate of climb speed as shown by the POH when we showed that earlier. I will try to show this in a different example because if you're familiar with boating, you'll know that on a light boat, like a ski boat, you can be mushing around in the water, but when you pull a skier or when you want to get on step, the boat actually climbs up on top and skims across the water. This is equivalent to being not on step. This is equivalent perfectly on step. And for those that understand that, they'll be able to relate to that. If I can, I will post a picture of a boat with this where the water is curling up in front of the bow of the boat and continuing being on the back side of this wave of water like this until it's able to smooth out, plane off, and get on step. When the gyroplane is at this correct speed, it's essentially on step and has this very nice, perfectly smooth climb out. We're going to demonstrate with this little sample of how temperature and weight affect takeoff performance. Now I realize that this isn't an MTO sport. This is actually a jet, but to be honest with you, you'll be surprised how much just a little bit of weight change makes a difference on these speeds down here. Right now I have it set at 60,000 pounds right here, temperature of 15 degrees Celsius, and standard pressure altitude, 2992. What we're going to do is we're just going to start with temperature. This is 15 degrees Celsius, and they consider that standard. But in Texas, that's in wintertime maybe. Usually in the summer, it's going to be more, say, around 25 to 39. So we're going to go ahead and change this really quick. Let's say we change this to 30. Suddenly this V1 speed went from 114 to 119. Quite a bit of a change just in 15 degrees Celsius. We can go ahead and play around with this number a little bit if we want to, but you can see where temperature, without even changing pressure altitude, makes a big difference on our takeoff speeds. Okay? Gyroplane and any other aircraft works exactly the same way. Maybe not on quite the scale, but you'll see this is going to be interesting. I'm going to go ahead and put it back to 15C, and it says 114, 5 knots lower. We're going to go over here to the weight, and we're just going to add, say, 200 pounds, because really in a gyro, most of these base speeds are figured one person, standard temperature, at about 200 pounds for the first person. Well, let's add another 200 pound or two there for, say, most of the modern two-seat gyros and see what that does. So we'll go ahead and we'll put in 200 and see what we get. All right, that one That's 20 pounds. Sorry, I made a mistake. Let's go ahead and put in 200 and see what we get. All right? That didn't make much of a change. Let's say we go to, say, 500 pounds. There we go. It went up 2 knots right there on its speed. Now remember, this is what happens in a 60,000 pound jet with a 500 pound change. The relationship of that change is so insignificant in comparison to adding 2 more 100 pounds to a gyroplane. So I'm just using this little quick scale to show you how weight and temperature is going to adversely affect your takeoff speeds. And so the POH that it might show a takeoff speed that people are used to here, put that down there, really is all based on condition. And we need to understand that. And a lot of times people don't understand that that is exactly what it's based on. It's based on perfect conditions. Now let's move on. Now a little more discussion on taking off below the power curve. What you're going to see is some pictures of crashed gyroplanes. Most of them on takeoff events. One of them, however, it looks like a newer style yellow one in the trees. I'm not sure if that was something that happened later. Has a fuel tank in the back. A couple of them with high angles of attack on takeoff. There's a yellow MTO, it looks like. Could be a little too steep. I'd probably say normally, unless it's high wind, I'd avoid that kind of steepness. The next one shows MTO taking off really steep with 2 people, has a rotor strike from the rear. That one ends up in an upset aircraft. And then a couple of others, a very steep angle that end up torque rolling, which is a very common thing to do when they take off below the power curve. One way to practice recovery of this is at high altitude, practice slow flight. You should be doing this with your instructor anyway. If you've already had slow flight, go up and practice it again. The practical step for slow flight is to gain more distance between aircraft upon landing without having to do some other types of evasive maneuvers. That's why it's an FAA requirement in the United States for aircraft spacing. However, because of the high angle attack and high throttle setting, it tends to want to torque roll if you don't put in proper stick and rudder correction. Some of these takeoffs that maybe are a little bit steep at first, as long as there's obstacle clearance, can be recovered by putting in proper correction, lowering the nose slightly until you pick up appropriate climb out speed. That's about all I have to say about that. We're going to go on now for me doing an actual takeoff in the pattern at hooks.
6 tower, Gyro 446 Quebec Tango, holding short 17 left approach, ready for takeoff.
Gyro 446 Quebec Tango, hook tower, make left traffic, runway 17 left, clear for takeoff.
17 left, clear for takeoff, make left traffic, 46 Quebec Tango. At this point,
well, that traffic's so fast, you can cancel.
We'll go ahead and change this from brake to flight to release the rotor head, and the pre-rotator button's done by my thumb. At this point, as we're looking at this and I'm taxiing onto the runway to pre-rotate, we're going to make sure that we have this full forward. We're going to slowly throttle it and get the rotation of the rotor going up to approximately 200 RPM in the MTO. When that's done in this case, you'll notice that the engine RPM will be coming up to 3,000. The rotor RPM is getting close to 200. Then I will go ahead and start initiating the takeoff. And there we go, we're at about 200. I let go of the brake, the pre-rotator, the bring it to the back, the nose will come up, and I'm looking forward. Now we'll get proper rotor speed, almost 300, and we'll lift off at about 55 and do our climb out at 55. Beautiful, beautiful climb out. Now you see the top over serial right here. Use the foam trim right here to trim it out so that I'm climbing out at 55 knots, so that's climb speed. We'll climb up to approximately 900 feet. When we get up, we'll stay about to go ahead and turn it out. 6 alien. throttle back so the throttle's in the triangle. And cruise out the gyro and use trim to set it so that you don't have to touch anything. Maintaining RPM, altitude, and our airspeed cruise is going to be around 90 knots, 80 to 90. You can see that on the gauge. Again, maintaining our altitude as best we can for about 6
Tango, runway 17 left, good step.
So the option of 17 left, 46 Quebec Tango. Remember to listen for your radio calls to make sure that you're not missing what they're trying to tell you, and keeping your ear open for your tail number, and keeping things focused. Usually do a pattern that is similar to an airplane pattern because I'm in a pattern with them. And I want to make sure I can make runway in case I lose an engine. And from here at 1,000 feet, I've made runway many times just to demonstrate this at 50 feet.
This tower number 2098 Alpha Solo is on Foxtrot, holding short of Echo, and is ready to take off for pattern for, stay in the pattern for a full stop taxi back. Just 2098 Alpha Tower, runway 17 right at Echo, so take off, make right traffic, wind 110 left. Clear for takeoff and Echo, make right traffic 2098 Alpha, winds noted.
At this point, on base to final, I'll slow it down to 3,000 roughly. 55 knots is best glide, same as best takeoff, and I'll trim it with the front trim so I can let go of the aircraft and let it do what it needs to do. Then we'll turn. Go ahead, we have a big runway here, we are cleared for the parallel, so 17 left, and we'll come in, doing our best to maintain 55, our best glide. Trying to do our pre-landing checklist. Second fuel pump is on, landing light on, reduce engine RPM for proper glide, which we did. Okay. Pitch for 55 knots, which we're doing. Align center on the runway. We drifted a little to the right. Maintaining best glide, 55. Coming in a line straight for a nice smooth touchdown. There we go. Now we want to make sure our RPM is still up at 300 because we're at takeoff speed. Then we have that ground speed of about 55, and it should come right off. If we let this thing bleed off too much below 200, then we have an issue going on where we can actually have so much drag on the takeoff roll that will lift into the air and it'll spin up to 300 and we'll come right back into the ground where I can ground effect. We want to make sure we kind of glance at this before we do our next takeoff when we're doing touch and goes so that we don't have that problem.
Once again, thanks so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share with others. Let's try to make this sport as safe as we can.